Hello. Okay, it's been a while since I've done a tutorial, but this one's been sitting around waiting for a video. I was just really busy with the jam, and if you didn't know I was making a jam game, then you should go play it. I'll link it in the description below. You get to be a wizard, and it uses some more advanced versions of some of the stuff I'm going to show here for making enemies that can fly. So without further ado, here are some enemies, and they're flying enemies, and they're not using kind of, I guess, the standard EFPSE trick of making invisible blocks underneath the enemies. You can shoot under these dudes. They're not just really tall sprites. They're actually flying, and they die and they fall down when they're dead. So let's look at how this is done. There is no loop script with this. The whole thing can just be done with FSM. And there are two FSM files that matter. There is flying guys that control the guys, and then floating platforms which control the floating platforms that they're actually standing on. And so if I run the game and we do some debug stuff, so let's turn on debug FSM, and let's turn on debug colliders, like that. We can see that what's actually going on here is our enemy is here, and underneath him, you can see it's in waiting state. There's this floating platform, and basically he is standing on that floating platform, and that is what is making him fly. And so how do we set this up? How do we get each enemy to have their own unique floating platform? You can see in the editor that I've got a flying guy and a floating platform and a flying guy and a floating platform. But obviously, if you've messed around with any of this, you know that this guy and this guy, they can't actually talk to each other most of the time. They don't know that they're there. If I place another guy, I don't have to place a floating platform next to him. I can place this floating platform anywhere on the map. It wouldn't matter as long as there are an equal number of floating platforms and flying guys. We will have guys that fly by standing on invisible floating platforms like this. So first thing to look at, I guess, is the flying guys themselves, and kind of let's look at the theory for how this works. So each flying guy is basically in any frame in which they're moving. They are going to get their position. So check pos returns their X, Y, and Z position. And they're then going to basically broadcast that position into a map array variable. So they'll send their X, their Y, and their Z, those three values will get sent off to an array. Any frame in which they're moving. So every time their position updates, they broadcast where their position is, they're into an array, and then this floating platform will basically read from that array, get their XY position, and position itself underneath them, and then fly up 80 units. If we wanted them to fly higher, we could change this value, they would fly high. And that's kind of it. The kind of, I guess, clever, in inverted commas, bit is using the array in order to be able to broadcast the values between the two guys. So how do we link these up? And that is done in the idle state. So you can see in state idle, we come in, and the first thing that we do is we have this command that says jump. If setup is 1, then jump to waiting. Okay, so the very first time this runs, setup will be 0, so we won't jump to waiting. And then we're going to do a few little bits here, and then we set setup to 1. So from then on, if we ever come into idle state, we'll hit this jump right at the start, and we'll jump to waiting, and we won't run these lines again, and that is important that we don't. So what happens here is we have this value called myID. We're going to have a myID on our flying guy, and we have a myID on our flying platforms. And so when our first guy gets initialized at the start, it's going to come into his script, and it's going to set his myID variable to map.current enemy variable, map.enemy var, whatever, right? And because we've never done anything with this variable anywhere, it'll be 0, and so the first enemy's ID will be 0. We're then going to increment this value by 1, and this is just some debug, sorry, I commented it out before, let's take it out. So we're going to set his value, the first enemy that gets their value set will be 0, and we're going to increment it by 1. So when the next enemy initializes, their ID will be set to 1, and they will increase it to 2. And then when the next enemy initializes, their variable will be set to 2, and they'll increment it to 3, and so on and so forth. So every enemy will get a unique number in their myID from 0 upwards. And as you can see, we do, I'll take this little debug line out. As you can see, we do the same thing with the floating platform. So every floating platform gets a myID, and then we have this map.current floater, which gets increased by 1. And so the first floating platform that gets spawned will have myID 0, the second one will have 1, the third one will have 2, and so on and so forth. So every floating platform has a unique ID from 0 upwards, and every flying guy has a unique ID from 0 upwards. If you imagine it like this, effectively what we're going to end up with is this is enemy 1, and this is enemy 2, and this is enemy 3, and so on. Oh, sorry. God, isn't programming annoying? That's not the case. Let's just pretend I didn't say that. This is enemy 0, and this is enemy 1, and this is enemy 2. I made the classic mistake. But also we have these floating platforms. And so this will be floating platform 0, and this will be floating platform 1, and this will be floating platform 2. Okay? So what happens in our flying guy state then is he checks what his X, Y, and Z position is. And then, for reasons that are almost not worth explaining, we set a map variable called tempvar to his myID, right? So let's just, for the sake of argument, say that his ID is 0. We're going to basically set map.tempvar to 0. And then we're going to set an array to his X, Y, and Z positions. So I'm just going to copy this into a new file just to explain a bit more. I'm sorry, if you know exactly what arrays are, then this is going to be boring for you. But if you don't, then hopefully this will help you understand how it works. So his ID is 0, and so this map.tempvar basically ends up equaling 0, which means we're going to set map.enemyx 0 to his X position, and map.enemyy 0 to his Y position, and map.enemyz 0 to his Z position, right? Because this tempvar value is 0. So basically we're just putting 0 into here. And then when we run our flying guy whose ID is 1, all that will happen is his variable here will actually equal 1 instead. And so all of these values will equal 1, and his X and his Y and his Z will go into the 1. You can basically imagine that whatever number you put in here, you delete the brackets, and really all you've got is a variable that's actually just called map.enemyx1, map.enemyy1, map.enemyz1, and this is map.enemyz0. It's like you're getting a whole bunch of named variables for free without having to manually go and type all those things. You can just drop that variable in, which means that they can all have the same script, but because they're putting this little unique number into those variables, it lets us them actually all have different variables, right? So now we have a list somewhere in memory. It's not in our loop. We're not referencing it in our loop script, but somewhere in memory we have stored for the enemy with ID 0, we've stored their X, Y, and Z, and for the enemy with ID 1, we've stored their X, Y, and Z, and so on. And so now the floating platform, it's going to get those positions, right? So it sets tempvar to its ID, right? And so if we, open paint, enemy 0 has set its X and Y and Z to map 0, map X0, map Y0, map Z0, and they're going to be equal to some values, right? And then floating platform 0 is going to read these because it has the same ID as the enemy. And so in here you can see that we've got this new Y, new X, new Y, and new Z, and we read from enemy X, enemy Y, enemy Z with that ID in there. So basically the enemy sets its X, Y, and Z into this array, and then the floating platform reads those same positions from that X, Y, and Z in the same array, and it positions itself at those positions. Now, interesting little quirk that's worth knowing if you're going to be reading values from the get X, get Y, get Z, and then putting them into move, is that when you use the move command, the value you read for Y becomes the move command for X, the value you read for X becomes the Z command for move, and the value you read for Z becomes the Y command. I don't know why, it just is, it's EFPSE. So these go into here, and that moves the floating platform. You can also see that one other thing happens, which is that when this guy dies in his death state, he also sets an array called map.killmarker plus his ID, right? So enemy 0 will set map.killmarker 0 to 1. And when the floating platform reads that the enemy with the same ID has set their version of the kill marker variable to 1, it'll transfer to dead. And what that means is that if you kill the enemy, it'll also kill the platform. And because enemies have gravity, that means they then fall back down to the ground. If you don't do that, if I took this line out, if you did not set that variable, then we have like no way of knowing, the platform has no way of knowing that the enemy has died, and so it will still exist. And so the enemy will just die, but they'll be floating in the air, like this. Which you may want, I don't know. But like, if you don't want that to happen, then you are going to need to do something like that. Hopefully this has not only showed you how to make enemies that can fly, but it has also shown you that there are ways using arrays without having to access any scripting in the loop script. This is only using those two FSMs, but using arrays as this method to send values between them, you can do anything. You can make any two objects talk to each other as long as you have created some way of those objects having the same ID. The same ID lets them both talk to the same part of an array and get values out of it. Anyway, I will upload this so you can play with it. I will caveat this by saying that I did flying enemies in Void Magic. They use this as a basis, but those enemies can also pathfind up and down. They don't have a fixed flying height, they have a variable flying height, so they can move around. They do a bunch of other stuff that this doesn't. But to explain this like in a way that's not going to be an hour-long video, I cut this down into kind of maybe like the simplest version of this, because if you want to do vertical pathfinding, if you want every enemy to spawn its own flying platform, if you want to be able to spawn enemies and not place them at the start and all this kind of stuff, like you can do that, and this is the basis for doing that. But to explain all of that is probably just going to be too confusing. This might be too confusing as it is, who knows? But hopefully this makes some sense to you. I have mostly commented all of the scripts in here, so yeah, feel free to download it and check it out and play around, and if you make something cool with it, drop me a message and show me. I would love to see it. Have fun, and I love y'all, and enjoy a nice cup of tea